Well, welcome to what is definitely going to be the last of these videos, based on the book that I helped to write a number of years ago. I'm Not Supposed to Feel Like This. And I was hoping to get to the end last time with the second session on help for church leaders. Really ran out of time. So this, I'm absolutely determined, will be the final video in this series. I'm feeling very good today. Managed to get my hair cut yesterday, and I no longer feel like a long-haired lout, even if I probably behave like one. So where we got to, particularly with the help for church leaders, well, with all of the videos, to be honest, the best thing is to do them in the order in which I've recorded them. But especially so with the help for church leaders. And where we got to was the building of a pastoral team. Some of this I will simply read, some of it I will comment on, and I hope you find this useful. But without more ado, because I'm determined that this is going to be the last one, and I have other things to do today, I'm going to get started. So pastoral teams, building a pastoral team, pastoral group, a pastoral structure. One of the things I think I commented last time is that people in churches sometimes are in the habit of calling themselves counsellors. This is something I would steer clear of completely, unless you are a qualified counsellor. For instance, you wouldn't go into a hospital and announce yourself as a qualified doctor because you know how to put a plaster on someone's cut or administer a bit of first aid. So it is with counselling. It's a highly specialised, highly qualified skill for which a great deal of training is required, which is very demanding and also very costly. If you want to go down that route, by all means, a great thing to do, but be aware it's quite a long road to become a qualified counsellor. So I do suggest, don't encourage people who do pastoral work in your church to call themselves counsellors in any way, whatever. This term has been used in things like evangelistic crusades, where people come forward and they are counselled. Well, maybe in that setting, in the context of coming to a personal faith, that is okay, but do be very careful about using the word counsellor. I don't use it myself. I make it clear I'm not a qualified counsellor. I haven't done the training. I have a certain amount of skill sets which enable me to do some counselling on a very limited level. Really, that isn't my discipline. So be very careful about that. But establishing a pastoral team is a really good thing to do, because otherwise an awful lot tends to devolve to the minister. And particularly where there are a number of acute cases, that can become very draining and take energy from other things that are of equal importance. Pastoral teams, unless the church is very big, should ideally be small, so that they can share together information that is confidential or partially confidential. It obviously is never right to break the confidences of those people who place their confidence, particularly without asking them permission. But we might want to share who we are talking to, who we are concerned about, and so on. And that's best done in a small group. Of course, if you have a very large church, that may not be possible, and you may need a very large pastoral group. I was the minister of a church with a pastoral team of about 23, I think, at one point, and I really found that rather unwieldy. Key qualities for people who are involved in pastoral care: empathy. Defined as the ability to get alongside someone and put yourself in their place. If you can't, at least on some level, engage with feeling what the person you are caring for is feeling, then it's difficult to be a pastoral carer, because you are too detached. I mean, on the other hand, It's really important that in terms of boundaries that you're not so engaged that it's impossible for you to be objective about the situation. Sometimes people go one or two ways. They either aren't very empathic and are prone to tell the person they're with what they should do and what they shouldn't do, which is generally a bad idea. Or they become so immersed in the problems of the person they're caring for that they can't be objective and they can't pull themselves out to live their own life. Both of those things are not helpful. Second quality, so first is empathy, second is warmth. You know what I mean by this. Some people really aren't cut out to pastoral carers. That is not a criticism, but a warmth which it's a bit like a fire. You know, like when you light a fire, you are that's warm. On a cold night, people are drawn to it, to sit near it, to enjoy the heat that radiates from it. Those are the sorts of people that is good to have on your pastoral team. People who are capable of acceptance. We deal with people pastorally who are in all sorts of places and perhaps in all sorts of a mess. They might well have got themselves in that mess, but it's no good simply telling that person that they shouldn't be where they are. You remember the famous story about the person asking for directions in China, because this is apparently an expression of Chinese culture, and saying, "Can you tell me the way to whatever it is?" And the person saying, "Well, I wouldn't start from here if I were you." Well, what's the option if I were you? Well, what's the option? The fact is that we have to start from where we are, and wherever the person we're with is, we must accept that. And that involves also being non-judgmental. Whatever you make of the situation that someone's in, whatever you think about the events and the decisions that have led them being in that place is largely irrelevant. They are where they are, and if pastoral carers are not prepared to start from where the person is, then they're not going to be an awful lot of use. It's a bit like saying, well, if you want to get there, I wouldn't start from here. That's utterly useless, isn't it? Non-judgmental as well goes with that. You know this saying about don't condemn anyone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Don't be judgmental, and particularly don't be overly judgmental. To be honest, if you feel like you're in a position where you're judging this person, then it will communicate anyway. Don't do that. We're not called to be judgmental. We're called to exercise discernment and wisdom. And if people have made bad choices, perhaps to encourage them to think about the choices they've made and make different choices, for sure. But that's very different from being judgmental. It really isn't a pastoral function to say to somebody, well, you've brought this on yourself, haven't you? There are people I want to say that to in church, but somebody in a place of need, particularly somebody with a mental health issue. Another quality, genuineness, being yourself. Just be the person you are. And when you when you are listening to somebody, when you're listening to somebody with mental health issues or just pastoral issues in general, it's a very hazardous thing to do. One thing is you kind of feel like you have to supply the answers, and you ain't got the answers. So your job is actually to listen rather than to answer. Maybe you can see a way forward and very, very gently encourage the person to think along those lines, but very gently. You're not expected to have the answers. And the other thing that'll happen when you're in pastoral situations, when you're pastorally caring for people, is that their problems will touch somewhere in your life where you yourself have weakness, and it's very difficult because you identify some of the problems you're hearing as some of the problems that you have. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that you then share all your difficulties with the person you're attempting to care for pastorally, but neither should you avoid being genuine about yourself, because one of the effects when someone is sharing something that touches a nerve in our life, we want to go into professional mode, we want to go into detached mode, we want to avoid the uncertainty and the pain that it is causing within ourselves in listening to the issues that they're facing. And then we stop becoming ourselves and we become somebody else. And that's no good either. It's a very skilled discipline to learn to be non-judgmental, to be objective, to be empathic, to be a genuine person whilst not indulging in sharing your own issues with the person you're caring for. It's not easy, but genuineness is very important. And then patience. If you're one of those people that needs to see quick results, forget pastoral care. And it's fine, do something else. Do youth work, play music, learn to preach. It's a lot easier to preach than it is to care for people pastorally. If you lack patience, then please don't get into pastoral work. You'll like be a hit and run merchant. You sort of want to drift in, solve the problem, zap, 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 and zip out again. And it doesn't work. If you really want to help people with mental health issues, if you want to build a pastoral team that will help with such issues, you need people who will draw alongside those who are distressed and in need, who will give lots of time and will regard it as a long-term project. If it ends up not being a long-term project, that's fantastic, but generally it will. If you are not a patient person, then there are plenty of jobs for you in church. But pastoral care is probably not one of them. So I've put there that read some of the interactions Jesus had with others to see just how well he achieved this in his own ministry. You look at some of the exchanges that Jesus had with people. He took time. I'm always really impressed by the story of the woman at the well and Jesus in John 4. Jesus has time for this Samaritan woman, and he sits down and he talks to her, and gently he gets to the root of the problem, very incisively, and he has time. Jesus, the Son of God, he only had 3 years of public ministry, and he had time for people like that. He had time for individuals and to get alongside individuals and to be with them. So build a pastoral team, but be very careful how you build it. There are people who want to be pastoral carers and be absolutely honest, that really not appropriate and need to be redirected to something that they'll be much better at. Enough on pastoral teams. Choosing a pastoral team. There's a bit there on how to make the pastoral team visible. Things like contact maybe one contact phone number, pictures on a board of who the pastoral carers are. Don't give out information that people are not comfortable receiving. Give them a profile as well in the services. Methodist Church I served in for a while had a really good, really great things. In the Covenant service, which Methodists hold at the start of each year, they also had the rededication of the pastoral team, which I thought was a great idea. So it's good to give the pastoral team a kind of visibility so that people know where to go. But almost certainly you'll if you aren't doing it yourself as a principal church leader, then you'll need somebody who is a pastoral coordinator to direct people, and perhaps your role is to say, I really think it would be a good idea if you had a chat and a pray with so and so. There is a need for leadership and accountability. One of the things that tends to happen, if you, particularly for pastors who are not that bothered about pastoral work and really want to be out there preaching the word and or leading worship and taking the kingdom for God and zapping along and achieving things, is to neglect the pastoral team. So I have a pastoral team that cares for people's needs. I'm just going to go on and preach the word and share Jesus. And that's great. If that's the way you're driven. I used to be driven that way. I'm not anymore. I'm very much driven by pastoral care. That probably comes with age. But if you are driven that way, and for you it's about proclamation and preaching and upfront leadership, and that's your forte, your métier, whatever, then you need a pastoral team, but you also need to care for them. And you need to make sure that they are well led. If you're not leading it yourself, find someone who will lead it, and create accountability. And within that, make sure that there is accountability, but also support. Because people, you know what it is. You take on other people's difficulties and issues, and it's very easy to absorb them and take them home. And you need the support of people who you can offload to. Make sure that your pastoral team has somewhere to go with their own issues and with the issues which they are hearing, so that they don't feel they're carrying unfair burdens. Offer effective training. There are plenty of organisations around. Be careful which ones you choose, but do offer effective training from good resources. Teaching people how to listen. Listening is a great skill. Teach people to listen. Teach people what to do when someone they're speaking to expresses suicidal thoughts, for instance. Help people to understand how to deal with severe mental health issues. What to do when someone's exhibiting symptoms of things like schizophrenia or any form of psychosis. Teach people the skill of confidentiality. If you can't do those things yourself, then there are plenty of organisations. Most denominations will have people who have expertise in this area, who will be able to direct and help and offer support and training to your pastoral team. Don't just assume that it will happen. Then avoid the dangers. There are all sorts of dangers. We've covered some of them. I'm not going to go over all of them. But there is a real danger of misuse of power. Some people are drawn to be part of a pastoral team for the wrong reason. They want to exercise power over somebody else's life. They may not see it that way, but that is effectively what they are doing. Somebody who is depressed and anxious will often say things. One of the things you will often hear when you're trying to support someone with depression or anxiety is something like, "Oh, I love talking to you. There's nobody else that understands me like you do. There's nobody else I can talk to the way I talk to you." Be aware that the chances are that someone saying that has said it to at least half a dozen different people over the course of time. This can make us feel like we are incredibly special. It puts us in a position of power, and it's very easy then to abuse that power. Remain objective about the situation. Be aware of people who will, who I mentioned before, the people who need to be needed, the people who need others to be dependent on them in order that they can avoid confronting their own issues. There's an awful lot of this that goes on in church. Be really careful about those people. Watch out for emotional abuse, even things like physical abuse and sexual abuse. One of the sad things, and one of the reasons why generally it's best for women to care pastorally for women and men to care pastorally for men, is because the churches are littered with stories of people getting into inappropriate sexual relationships with somebody they have been caring for pastorally. I won't go into detail, just to say it is, they are more numerous than you care to mention. Often, for instance, a man caring pastorally for a woman, the woman becoming dependent on the man, that it evokes all sorts of feelings in the man about being protective, and the two become enmeshed and a sexual relationship develops. This is going to sound awfully sexist. I'm aware of that, and I'm utterly unapologetic for it, because in my experience, it's usually that way around, and it's generally a heterosexual situation. I'm aware that there is a danger of same-sex inappropriate relationships. In my experience, it's nearly always the problem when it's a man and a woman becoming involved in a pastoral situation and becoming ever closer until it develops into something very different, and then it becomes, of course, incredibly destructive. Try to make sure that it's women with women, men with men. If you're a pastor, you will probably have more women in your congregation than you will have men. You will have to be in a situation where you care pastorally, in a situation of trust for women. If you're a man, that's almost inevitably the case. There are huge pitfalls down that road. It's important that you're accountable. I would be in the habit of telling my wife where I was going, who I was seeing, and how long I was going to be there, of making sure that the place I was in was a place where it was safe, and inappropriate things couldn't happen. And be aware as well. And I apologise again. This is going to sound sexist. That sometimes, particularly if you're a church leader, you're trying to support pastorally someone with mental health problems, a report will emerge that you behaved inappropriately with that person. I've had this myself, and on a fairly small scale, I should say. It happens a great deal. Protect yourself. If you really have to see a person of the opposite sex on a one-to-one basis, make sure it is in an environment where inappropriate allegations cannot be made, and you are not put into a situation of temptation with somebody who is, after all, a vulnerable person. Make sure those safeguards are in place, because it only takes one slip, one moment of misjudgment to wreck your ministry. That's all it takes. So don't go there, and make sure that you don't go there. So that's sexual abuse and inappropriate sexual behaviour. And then spiritual abuse. It can be things like encouraging people to repeatedly confess their sins, to go into great detail about their spiritual life, to try to manipulate, to tell people how they should be living. You know, the sort of thing where what's going on spiritually is that the pastoral carer is using this relationship of pastoral care to boost their own ego, to cover up their own inadequacies, and so on. Or because they have an idea in their head about exactly how this person should go forward in their life and determined to make it happen. So effectively become rather preachy in that relationship. Those are some of the pitfalls. Betrayed confidentiality. I used to be in a church where I used to say to my wife, I know how to get news around the church so that everybody gets to hear it. I tell my leaders in something in confidence, because they would tell their wives, and their wives or their spouses would pass it around, and it would get to everybody. Confidentiality is, of course, absolutely crucial. Sometimes you hear things like, well, I'm just telling you this, and I wouldn't tell anybody else, but I'm telling you for prayer, so that you can pray for this person. And then out comes the confidence, because some people are simply bursting to share the confidences that they've received. It's an absolute no-no. And for me, once somebody in a pastoral team has betrayed a confidence in that way, they're out. That is the end of them. I would not allow them anywhere near the kitchen, as it were, after that. Be really, really clear about what is expected in terms of confidentiality. One thing you could do is write out a mental health care policy. You might not want to publish it, but perhaps say, here is a chart of people in our church. In terms of pastoral care, but especially in relation to mental health, these are the things that you can expect. That you can speak to somebody on a one-to-one basis in confidence, that you can speak without being interrupted, and so on. That your voice will be heard. You won't be told what you must do. You'll be supported, whatever choices you make, and so on. Having a mental health care policy is not a bad idea for a church. Now, finally, getting on to the really difficult issues of healing and deliverance. This is where it gets really thorny. I'm going to read you a paragraph from the book which illustrates that this is to do. This is a not untypical case. As the minister of a local church, I'd never before encountered someone who heard voices in their head. And once I knew those voices were telling the person to harm themselves, all my theological instincts told me that these voices must be coming from demonic forces possessing the young woman I was praying for. Whether or not this was true is still something of a mystery, but the real eye-opener came a few months later when I began speaking to a number of people in an acute psychiatric ward and came to the realization that such voices were actually quite a common occurrence and a normal part of a number of mental health problems. It is very easy, this is dealing with the question of deliverance, it is very easy to jump to conclusions that a person's mental health difficulties come from a demonic source, particularly if they are things like hearing voices, and those voices are essentially telling them to do destructive things. Now, how do we do justice to the biblical material where deliverance from demonic forces is very much a part of the life of the early church, and at the same time hold in our heads that such things as hearing voices are a very common expression of severe mental health issues? When do we say, how do we answer the question? Is this just a psychiatric condition, or is it demonic? And of course, essentially, we are not qualified to make that judgment, because unless you have qualifications in terms of psychiatry and mental health, you don't have the capacity to make that judgment. So what do we do? And so I don't take that approach. Please excuse my phone. It always goes off at the most difficult time. So how do we hold that against the knowledge that people do hear voices, and it's nothing to do with anything demonic? It's simply a part of a mental health issue. I asked this question once to somebody who I respected hugely, who worked at a Christian hospital called Burswood, which I think doesn't exist anymore now, sadly. A wonderful place in Kent. I said, how do you do this? So what do you do when you're faced with something and you say, is this just a psychiatric disorder, or is this demonic? And his advice, I've followed ever since. It was brilliant advice. He said, well, the first thing is we because he was also a doctor, a psychiatrist, he said the first thing we do, we treat it as if it's a mental illness. We address it on the level of being a psychiatric disorder. And then we see what's left. If, having done everything in terms of psychiatry and mental health care and professional nursing and so on, if there is something left which appears to be spiritual, then very gently and very carefully we will address that. We will look at that possibility. And I've generally found that in almost every case, these difficulties are essentially psychiatric. It's a mental health issue. And once the mental health issue is treated, the thing that appears as if it might have been demonic disappears. Almost virtually every case. So I encourage you to take that approach. And of course, that means, unless you're a qualified psychiatrist yourself, giving time and energy and support to the process of mental health care from professionals in the world of psychiatry, and then going very far, specialists in this area. I'm not a specialist in this area, but be very, very careful and make sure that you bring in to that situation the appropriate professional support. If after having done all of that, you suspect there might be something that is essentially demonic going on in that person's life, but tread incredibly carefully because of the possibility of doing huge damage to the person you're caring for, and make sure that you have the specialist ministry that's needed for support and guidance, and tread incredibly carefully. In terms of healing, of course, pray for healing of people with mental health issues, but be prepared. John Lockley's also written a book on helping Christians with depression, called The Practical Workbook for the Depressed Christian. He has this wonderful chapter called God's Gymnasium, or something like that. And he says sometimes working through a mental health issue is a bit like going to the gym. There is something that you have to work through. And by building up your muscles, you're able to help yourself. Sometimes, particularly low-level feelings of depression and anxiety can be God's way of helping you to grow, unpleasant as that may be. And so sometimes it's appropriate to say, not simply, can I pray for healing, but can I pray that through this experience, unpleasant as it is, you are able to grow as a person. And so there's two things going on. There's healing, but there is also perhaps a dealing with issues from the past that are troublesome. And so sometimes people hitting a patch of depressive illness, unpleasant as it is, can actually be a gateway to a more fulfilled life. And that's where really skilled pastoral care comes in. And what I'd say to you about praying for healing is do pray for healing. By all means, pray for healing. Pray for healing for someone with mental health issues exactly the same way you pray for healing for someone with a medical condition that is more visible. Somebody has a chronic respiratory disease, an infection. Pray for them. If it's appropriate, and I stress if it's appropriate, lay hands on them carefully and pray for them. Pray for healing. But also be prepared to be in that for the long term, and to pray for what God wants for that person, which may not necessarily be exactly what you want. Let's be honest. As a pastor, I've prayed for more people than I care to remember. I've prayed for healing, and sometimes I've seen people healed quite miraculously. But I have to say, by and large, people are not healed miraculously. Now, maybe that's because I don't, about an expression of inadequacies in my spiritual life. I don't know, but most of us, I think we that's what we experience. Mostly, we don't see people healed supernaturally, so we pray in the long term. And part of prayer for healing is not simply praying for someone to get better in a person's life. So do pray for healing and be prepared to pray over a period of time. Don't regard that as an alternative to medical intervention, but regard it as in addition, just as you would pray. If you pray for someone, someone had a broken leg, would you pray for their healing? Yeah, of course you would. But you would pray, wouldn't you, for God to add his healing to the process of healing which will happen naturally and particularly with the assistance of medical professionals. Pray for someone with mental health issues, with depression, anxiety and so on, in exactly the same way. Pray that God will add his healing to the healing that comes through the care of the people who are qualified to do it. Don't raise unrealistic expectations, and particularly don't claim that healing has taken place when it hasn't. And here's this particular hazard with praying for people with depression and anxiety, because often when you've prayed for someone with feeling depressed, they'll say, "Oh, I feel a lot better now." It's then tempting to say, "Well, hallelujah, praise the Lord, the depression's gone." No, they're just feeling a bit better. And it may be that's certainly part of the healing process. It may just be that it's very temporary. So be prepared to pray and keep on praying, and to be patient and be aware that the process of healing doesn't go like that. It goes sort of like that. And sometimes it goes off the bottom of the chart. Keep praying and don't give up. Never burden the person you're praying for with accusations of failure. One of the things that really makes me very, 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 very cross is when people said to her simply, "How are you getting on with believing for healing for your condition?" This lady had a life-limiting condition which ultimately killed her. And the message was, if you have enough faith, you'll be healed. You get this, just believe enough and you'll be healed. I've got two things to say to that. One is that it ain't so. Plenty of people I've known, for instance, the late, great David Watson, who died of liver cancer, who absolutely believed that he was going to be healed, had no doubt whatever, and he wasn't. And the whole country the whole Christian nation was praying for him. It isn't true that if you have enough faith, you'll be healed. But here's the real rub. Never put failure of someone to be healed, never put that burden on the person you're praying for. If you read your New Testament, you'll discover that very frequently, if not in the majority of cases, the faith was on behalf of the people who were doing the praying and not on the person who was being prayed for. Think about the friends who lowered their chum through the roof for Jesus to heal him. It was the friends who had the faith. It is so often the case. So if there is a lack of faith anywhere, it's in the person doing the praying, not the person being prayed for. Never place that burden on somebody. Do pray expectantly. Do believe that God can work miracles, but do be aware often that doesn't happen, and you have to be in it for the long term and for your prayer to be part of the healing process, along with all sorts of other medical and psychiatric intervention. Whatever the outcome of the prayer for healing, ensure that that person is supported pastorally. So you're prayed for and nothing happens. What do? You feel a failure. You feel that you might be abandoned by the person who's caring for you. Make clear to the person being prayed for that you are in it for the long term and you will carry on caring and carry on praying. And something when you do see God bringing about a miracle in someone's life. So I think that takes us to the end pretty much of the book. There's just a little bit on deliverance principles here that I'll just read to you, because I think this probably puts it succinctly in a way that I wasn't able to do before. So the Bible confirms the existence of demonic powers. Mental illness is not caused directly by such powers. On the rare occasions when demonic forces cause mental distress, there will be characteristics of the presentation that make it distinct from cases of mental illness. In particular, there are likely to be occult elements involved, and the usual pattern of symptoms seen within mental disorders will be absent. Deliverance should be considered only when a mental illness has been excluded or effectively treated, and when the church leadership and pastoral teams think it necessary. So first ensure that the patient has told their doctor of all their symptoms. If demonic influence is suspected, try to involve people such as those mentioned opposite, coming to that, who have experience. Recap. If demonic influence is suspected, try to involve people who have experience of this kind of spiritual warfare and have credibility is the crucial thing. There are plenty of people who say they've got experience and they haven't, and they lack credibility. Local churches may find that they have members who have gifts of spiritual discernment. However, these should be formally tested and recognised within the church and not merely be based upon the opinion of the person themselves. Some denominations and church groups have specified regional advisors who have particular experience in this area. This should not, however, bypass the existing church leadership. Deliverance ministry should never be undertaken by one person acting alone. Ensure that there is accountability to the church leadership as a whole for those undertaking a deliverance ministry. Ensure that strong pastoral support is available before any deliverance ministry takes place for the person and for those praying for them. That's the whole thing about deliverance. Really tread very, very, very carefully with your church in terms of issues of depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. Work towards a culture within your church that allows Christians to be distressed. Encourage an atmosphere of love, support, openness, and honesty when such needs arise. Sermons, house groups, and other teaching should intermittently cover topics like depression, anxiety, bereavement, and distress. This allows such topics to be seen as a normal part of life for many Christians. These teachings provide an opportunity to discuss how faith can help support those who are distressed. Examples for discussion include the experience of Job, as discussed earlier on in the book. Stick to the basics. Let the person know that they are accepted and loved by God. Don't get into repetitive arguments about God's love for them. A simple statement will suffice. Show love through your attitude. Listen and ask questions to help you to understand how the person with mental health problems feels. Don't try to immediately solve their problems for them. Asking questions may be more helpful than telling the person your own answers. Provide permission so that the person can relinquish certain tasks in church, not lead groups, etc., if they have such a workload and this is proving part of the problem. Similar advice is also relevant for other areas of life, such as home and work commitments. Protect the person. Watch out for and try to correct unhelpful relationships with others in the church, such as the person surrounding themselves with others who also feel distressed. Decide who are the best people to help in the church. People with a calling and gifts in the area of pastoral care and encouragement should be identified. Create a pastoral support team that is well trained and staffed by people who are in it for the right reasons, to support others rather than to meet their own inner needs. In any church, God will have provided people with the gifts and calling to support this work. Try to identify and support these people in this work and make sure that this is offered within a clear structure that is monitored to ensure that something that is safe, effective, and helpful is offered. And that pretty much is the end of the book, and it's the end of the all the things that I want to say. Do consider buying it. I don't say that because I make a fortune. I get very little for every one of these that's sold, but it is a good book, and it's recommended by Christian Medical Association and others, and it's stood the test of time. So do consider buying a copy if you can afford it, and then you can keep it as a reference. I hope you've enjoyed these videos. I hope they've been useful to you. Even if you've disagreed with some of the things I've said, then that's absolutely fine. And opinions that are thought through that differ from mine are more than acceptable. Thank you for being in the business of caring for people with depression and anxiety and other mental health issues. It's a difficult and demanding thing to do, and you have to be in it for the right reasons. So thank you for being in that world. Tread carefully and stay close to God, and listen carefully to what He might be saying to you. And I pray and trust that in your pastoral care for those in this situation, that you will find great fulfillment. And those of you who've been watching this as a sufferer with depression and anxiety, you'll now know what your church leaders are supposed to do, at least what I think they're supposed to do. And I hope you found that useful as well. It's been great sharing this series with you, and I hope and pray that people find it useful. So thank you for listening. You can put any comments you want to on the YouTube channel. I will read them. I tend not to get involved in debates on YouTube channels, but any comments I will read. And thank you for listening and sharing. And you look after yourself and stay safe. Bye.